She was already dying when he found her. The moonlight did not soften what it touched that night. It only made everything crueler, the pale silver of it spilling across the clearing like cold water, illuminating the wound in her side, the dark stain spreading through the fabric of her dress, the way her fingers had curled into the frost-hardened earth as though she were trying to hold on to the world itself. She was losing. The world was letting go. He knelt beside her and did not speak. There were no words for what moved through him in that moment. Not grief, not panic, not the ancient calm that had carried him through centuries of silence. It was something older than all of those. Something he had no name for because he had never needed one before. He had lived 900 years without needing a name for what it felt to lose something irreplaceable. His hand moved to his chest, pressing flat against the place just beneath his sternum where the warmth lived. Where it had always lived, that dense, luminous pulse that was not quite a heartbeat, not quite a flame but something between the two. The fox bead. The nucleus of everything he was. Every memory, every transformation, every year of power accumulated across lifetimes, it all resided there, threaded through him like light through glass. To remove it was to begin dying. He knew this. He had always known this. His fingers pressed deeper, and for a long moment the only sound in the clearing was the wind moving through the pine trees and the shallow, wet rhythm of her breathing. Then, with a gentleness that did not belong to someone capable of the things he was capable of, he pressed his palm to her lips and exhaled. The bead passed from him like a last breath. The light that left his body was extraordinary, a warm amber gold that rose and dispersed into the night air like something finally freed after a very long captivity. For one suspended moment the clearing was bathed in it. Her face, slack and bloodless, was briefly beautiful in the glow. Then the light was gone and the darkness returned, deeper than before. She gasped. Her fingers uncurled from the earth. He sat back on his heels and looked at his hands. They were trembling, not with effort but with absence. Something enormous had just vacated the space behind his ribs, and what remained was a quiet so profound it felt like the inside of a tomb. He had 1 year left until ascension. He had sacrificed it in a single breath. And she was alive. He looked at her, truly looked, the way only someone who has chosen something irreversible can look, and felt, beneath the vast emptiness now living in his chest, something that might have been peace. Or its shadow. But this story did not begin with sacrifice. It began, as so many terrible and beautiful things do, with an accident. Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this take time, patience, and a lot of heart to create. And your support truly means everything. 3 seasons earlier, the mountain village of Sianhua sat tucked between 2 ridgelines like a secret the land had decided to keep. It was the kind of place that did not appear on government maps. Not because it was hidden, exactly, but because the people who lived there had never seen any reason to be found. They grew barley and kept goats. They buried their dead in the hillside and told their children not to wander past the old cedar line after dark. They had their own calendar, their own superstitions, their own quiet grammar of survival. And deep in the forest above the village, in a structure that could only loosely be called a house, walls of aged pine, a roof grown over with moss, windows that faced north toward the ridge, there lived a man the villagers had quietly decided not to question. He had appeared perhaps 5 years before or 6. No one could quite agree on when. He brought nothing with him and asked for nothing. He repaired his own roof. He grew nothing but seemed never to go hungry. He was unfailingly polite in the rare moments he came down to trade dried herbs for lamp oil or rice paper, and his manners were so exact, so composed, so faintly antique in their precision, that the older women of the village had long suspected he was educated far beyond what a hermit in the mountains had any right to be. His name, he had told them once, was Seojin. He had said it simply, without the weight names usually carry when offered to strangers, and somehow that simplicity had settled the question for most of the villagers. He was Seojin. He lived in the forest. He kept to himself. That was enough. What was not enough, what no amount of quiet politeness or careful distance could fully conceal from someone who knew what to look for, was what he was. On the nights of the full moon, the forest above Sianhua moved differently. The animals went silent in a particular way, not the silence of a predator passing through, but the silence of everything lesser acknowledging the presence of something greater. The mist gathered around his house and stayed there until morning. Once, a child who had chased a runaway goat past the cedar line had come back speaking of a fox with 9 tails the color of pale fire, sitting motionless on a rock and watching her with eyes that were not an animal's eyes. Her mother had kept her home for a week and spoken of it to no one. Seojin had lived on the edge of human sight for 900 years. He had learned, in that time, The precise calibration of closeness, how near to come without being seen for what he truly was. He had watched civilizations arrange and rearrange themselves beneath him. He had felt the turning of the seasons the way a stone feels water without being moved. He had been, for most of his existence, utterly untouched. He was, by every measure, 41 years away from completing his full millennium, the span required for a Gumiho of his lineage to petition the heavens for ascension. To shed the fox shape entirely. To become something luminous and permanent and free of the old hungers. He had 41 years remaining when the woman came to the forest. Her name was Era, and she arrived in Xianhua on a morning in early autumn, carrying a cloth bundle on her back and wearing the particular expression of someone who has run out of other options. She was the younger sister of a village man named Park Youngwon, who had written to her in the city. There had been an illness in the family, a failing farm, a debt that was accruing interest like a wound accruing infection. She had come because there was no one else. The village received her with the cautious warmth of a community that had learned not to form attachments to people likely to leave. She was not beautiful in the way that announces itself. She was beautiful in the way of still water, the kind that takes a long time to notice and then, once noticed, cannot be unnoticed. She had a quality of absolute attention, the way she listened to things, the wind, an old woman's story, the sound a brook makes when it narrows, as though each had something worth hearing. She touched the world gently, and the world, in the subtle way of things, touched her gently back. She knew nothing about foxes. She knew nothing about the forest above the cedar line, except that her brother had told her, with the embarrassed seriousness of a grown man repeating something he half believed himself, that she should not go there alone at night. She went there alone in daylight on her third day in Xianhua. She was gathering medicinal herbs. Her grandmother had taught her the names and uses of the mountain plants, and she had recognized, on the hillside above the village, the feathered leaves of a plant used for fever reduction. She followed the plant uphill. Then she followed the next one. Then the next. The way it works with foraging, the small accumulation of small purposes that carries you much further than you intended to go. She was deep in the forest before she registered the silence. Not an absence of sound exactly. More like a fullness of it, the kind that presses against the ears and the chest simultaneously. She had stopped walking without realizing she'd stopped, and she was standing in a small clearing where a flat-topped boulder sat half buried in the hillside, and on that boulder, in absolute stillness, was a fox. She had seen foxes before. They were lean and quick and constantly performing some private urgency. They did not sit still. They did not look at you the way this one looked at her, with patience so complete it felt geological. And they did not have, she was reasonably certain, eyes that color. Gold, yes, foxes sometimes had golden eyes. But not this gold, not the particular depth of amber over firelight that she was looking into now, which had in it something that recognized her, some quality of awareness that her body responded to before her mind could. She stood very still. The fox did not move. Then, from behind her, "You've come further than the cedar line." She turned. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, dressed in dark layers, a cloth bundle of his own hanging from one hand. His face was composed and ageless in the way of someone who has made composure a practice rather than a mood. His eyes, when he looked at her, were the same color as the fox's. She looked at the boulder. The fox was gone. "I was gathering herbs," she said. "I know," he said. "I watched you coming up the hill." Pause. "You shouldn't gather the one with the feathered leaves. In autumn the stem becomes caustic. It'll blister the skin." She looked down at the bundle in her hands and opened it. The feathered leaf plant was there. She had gathered 6 of them. "Oh," she said. He crossed the clearing and crouched beside her bundle with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has done this assessment before. His hands sorted through her collection, setting aside this plant, leaving that one, and the whole time he did not look at her, only at her herbs, with total concentration. She found herself watching his hands. They were very steady. "These are fine," he said, indicating the kept pile. "These you should leave on the hillside." He stood. "The path down runs along the east face. It's faster and you won't lose the light." He turned to go. "You're Seojin," she said. "My brother mentioned you." He paused. Turned back just slightly. "And you're his sister. From the city. Era." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read. Then he said, "The east path," and walked back into the trees and was gone. She stood in the clearing for a long moment after he left. The stillness he had left behind was different from the stillness before, warmer, somehow, charged with something she had no language for. She took the east path. She was back in the village before the light changed. That night, she lay awake listening to the wind in the pine trees and thought about eyes the color of burning amber. The second meeting was accidental. Or it had the structure of an accident, which is a different thing. She had gone back to the forest, not to the clearing she told herself, but to gather more of the herbs she'd missed the first time. She told herself this with the particular conviction of someone constructing a story they half know is a story. She went in the morning, when the light was clear and practical and could not be accused of anything. She found him by following the sound of something she didn't recognize, a low, toneless hum, almost below the threshold of hearing, the kind of sound that vibrates in the sternum rather than the ears. It led her to a small spring she hadn't known was there, where he sat cross-legged on a flat stone with his eyes closed and his hands open on his knees, and the sound was coming from him. She stopped immediately. He did not open his eyes. "Sit down," he said, "or go back. Either is acceptable." She sat down. She was not sure why. She was not normally a person who sat down when told to by strange men in forests. But there was nothing threatening in how he said it. It was purely informational, the way you might tell someone the path went left. She sat, and the hum continued, and the spring made its small perpetual sound, and the forest did what it did around him, went very, very quiet as though listening. After a while the hum stopped. He opened his eyes. "What is it?" she asked. "A kind of maintenance," he said. "Maintenance of what?" He looked at the spring. "Of the things that hold me together." She absorbed this without pressing it, which was, she would realize later, the right choice. He seemed to register that she'd made it. He looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like the careful recalibration of an expectation. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't a question, but it carried the tone of one. "Should I be?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "The village thinks so." "The village is afraid of its own shadows," she said. "My brother sleeps with salt lines on the windowsills. He thinks evil things come in at night through the cracks." "Some things do," Seojin said, so quietly she almost didn't catch it. "Are you one of them?" He turned and looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation, and she felt it, that quality his gaze had, the weight and depth of something that had been looking at the world for far longer than any human face should contain. Her breath caught just slightly, just once. "No," he said. "Not in the way your brother means." It was not, she thought, a complete answer. But it was an honest one. She could hear the honesty in it, the careful line it walked between reassurance and disclosure, offering neither more than it could guarantee. They sat by the spring until the light shifted, and they spoke about small things. The herbs on the hillside, the taste of autumn in the air, the names of things her grandmother had taught her. He knew all the names she knew and many more. He spoke about plants with the intimacy of long acquaintance, and she listened with the quality of attention he had, she would later realize, begun to look for. When she left, she noticed she was smiling. She did not question it. She had not yet learned that this was the most dangerous thing the forest had ever given her. What happened between early autumn and the deep cold of winter was not a single event but an accumulation. A series of small gravitational adjustments, each individually negligible, collectively irreversible. She returned to the forest. He was there. She returned again. He was there again. They never arranged to meet. The meetings simply occurred with the inevitability of water finding a level, as though the forest were bending slightly each time to bring them together. He taught her things. The names of plants she hadn't known. The behavior of weather on the mountain before it descended into the valley. The way certain animals moved when something was watching them. He taught her these things with the unhurried patience of someone who has never been in a hurry, and she absorbed them with the focused pleasure of someone who had always been hungry to know more than the world had thought to offer her. And she, in turn, gave him something he had not had in a very long time, and might not have been able to name if asked: the experience of being known. Not observed. Not feared. Not avoided or quietly mythologized by a village that whispered behind his back while accepting his herb trades. Known, as in recognized. She asked him questions that assumed complexity in the answer. She paid attention to the way he paused before speaking, and she waited for the pauses to complete themselves instead of filling them with her own voice. She looked at him as though he were a person who contained things worth understanding. He had not been looked at that way in 900 years. This was the danger. Not the hunger. He had mastered that, centuries ago, the old Gumiho need that drove lesser spirits to steal the livers of sleeping men and leave their husks for morning to find. He had transcended that particular appetite through will and time and the accumulated discipline of a creature truly committed to becoming something better than what it was. The hunger was not the danger. The danger was this, being seen. By midwinter, He had begun to understand what was happening to him with the clarity of a man watching a fire spread toward something irreplaceable and not yet moving to stop it. He had begun to feel her absence when she wasn't there. This was new. He had lived 900 years without feeling absences. The world simply was what it was when it was in front of him, and when it was not, he occupied himself with other things. But now there was a specific shape to the time when she was away from the forest, a particular texture of emptiness that had her outline in it. He would be tending the fire or observing the mountain weather or moving through the particular meditative practice that kept his power calibrated, and he would find himself listening for footsteps that weren't coming. He began sitting by the spring at the same time each morning, not because the meditation required it, but because she had once come to him at that time, and some part of him was now always half expecting her. This was the undoing. Not of his nature. He remained completely what he was, and he never deceived her about that or not consciously. But of something else. The careful architecture of distance he had built and maintained for centuries, the elegant system by which he had remained adjacent to the human world without belonging to it, that was the thing beginning to dismantle itself, beam by quiet beam. There were laws for creatures like him. Not laws written anywhere, not decrees issued by any court, but laws in the structural sense. The same way gravity is a law, the way winter is a law. A Gumiho close to ascension was required to maintain separation. The accumulation of spiritual power that made ascension possible was incompatible with deep emotional attachment. Attachment was weight. Ascension required lightness. These were not moral prohibitions. They were facts of the way things were. He knew this. He knew this with 900 years of knowing behind it, the accumulated weight of every lesson his nature had ever taught him. He knew it the way he knew the names of things. And still, on a morning in late winter when the path up from the village had fresh snow on it and she appeared in the clearing with her cheeks bright from the cold and a look on her face that meant she'd found something in the hillside worth sharing, still, he was glad. The gladness was the warning. He received it, filed it, and did not act on it. He told himself he could contain this. He had contained larger things. He was wrong, but it would take the spring to show him how wrong. It was her brother who first noticed. Young one was not an unkind man, but he was a frightened one. And frightened people notice things that confirm their fears with particular efficiency. He had watched his sister go to the forest through autumn and winter with increasing frequency and decreasing explanation. He had watched her come back changed in some small way each time, quieter, more inward, wearing an expression he associated with people who are keeping something they don't know how to share. He told himself it was loneliness. He told himself it was the mountain air. He told himself, with decreasing conviction, many things. In early spring he followed her. He stayed well back. He was not a bold man, and the forest above the cedar line had never invited him, but he went far enough to see them together in the clearing near the spring. He saw them from a distance, through the trees. His sister and the hermit from the forest, sitting on flat stones beside the water, speaking in the easy, unhurried way of people who have become fluent in each other's silences. He watched for a long time. Then he went back down the mountain and spent 3 days being afraid in private before he did anything. What he did when he finally did something was send a letter. Not to the village elders. He had already decided correctly that they would handle it badly, with the blunt instrument of community consensus and communal fear. He sent the letter to a man he had met once years ago at a trade fair in the lowlands. A man who had asked him, with an odd specificity of interest, whether there were any unusual things in the mountains above his village. Whether there were animals that behaved strangely. Whether there were people in the forest who did not seem to age. He had given vague answers at the time. Now he wrote with more precision. The man's name was Kang Dae-hyun, and he wrote back within a week. He was already on his way. The thing about transformation is that it does not announce itself. It does not arrive with drama or declare its terms. It happens in the accumulation of small moments, and it is only afterward, looking back across all the small moments, seeing how they aligned, that the shape of it becomes visible. The shape of what had happened to Seojin became visible to him on an evening in early spring when Era was late coming to the forest, and he realized, standing at the edge of the clearing and watching the path that led up from the village, that he would wait for as long as it took. That the waiting did not feel like deprivation. That it felt like the most right use of his time he had discovered in 900 years. He stood very still for a long time after that realization. Then he sat on the flat rock and looked at his hands, those hands that had sorted her herbs with such careful practicality, had pointed her towards safe paths, had gestured at the mountain weather while explaining what it meant, and he felt, moving through him with the slow certainty of a tide, the full knowledge of what had already happened. He had crossed the line. Not in any single moment, not with any single decision, but in the way rivers cross borders. Gradually, inevitably, quietly. He loved her. He had not allowed himself the word before. He had accepted the gladness, the waiting, the warmth of being seen, accepted them with the careful compartmentalization of a being who has long known how to hold feeling at arm's length. But now the word was simply there, sitting in him with all its terrible weight and clarity, and there was nothing to do with it except know it. He was 41 years from ascension. He had accumulated 9 centuries of discipline and power and spiritual accumulation toward a single goal. All of it, the 1,000 small renunciations, the calculated distance, the patient practice of becoming something beyond hunger, all of it now existed in direct opposition to the thing sitting in his chest. The fox bead pulsed against his sternum, steady as always but differently weighted now. As though it too had registered the change and was adjusting to it. He was still sitting with this knowledge when he heard footsteps on the path. Not hers, heavier, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who has spent a long time learning how to move through forest without being heard and has succeeded well enough to be dangerous. He was on his feet before the thought completed itself, his senses extending outward into the trees, reading the shape and intent of the approaching presence. What he read made him go very still. The man who stepped into the clearing was large in the way of someone who had made himself large through will, not merely the physical size of him, which was considerable, but the intentional density of his presence, the way he occupied space as though he had surveyed it first and decided it was his. He was dressed in practical dark clothing and he carried no visible weapons. But Seojin registered, in the first fraction of the first second, that the absence of visible weapons was itself a kind of weapon, a deliberate performance of unthreatening that only the truly dangerous could afford. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at Seojin with eyes that were doing something specific. Cataloging. Measuring. The way a craftsman looks at material he intends to work with. Seojin, he said. It was not a question. Seojin said nothing. My name is Kang Dae-hyun. Pause. I've come a long way to find you. The forest held its breath. Somewhere below them in the village a door opened and closed. The sound of an ordinary life going about its ordinary business, thin and distant as something heard through water. Seojin looked at the man and saw, with the clarity of a being 9 centuries old, exactly what he was. Not human, not entirely or not anymore. Something had been done to Kang Dae-hyun, or something had been taken from him or given to him, and what remained was a person shaped by a very specific obsession, the kind that hollows you out and fills the space with purpose. He was a hunter. He had been a hunter for a long time. And whatever he had hunted before, he was here now in this clearing on this mountain, because someone had told him there was a Gumiho with a bead almost 1,000 years old sitting in the forest above a small village that hadn't thought to worry about such things. You should go back down the mountain, Seojin said. I've heard that before, Kang Dae-hyun said and smiled. The smile was not unfriendly. That, more than anything, was what made it frightening. I find it's rarely true. He turned then without hurry and looked back down the path. The path that Era would take to come up from the village. The path she had taken 100 times now through every season, until it was as familiar to her feet as the floor of her brother's house. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked back at Seojin. He said nothing. He did not need to. The message was in the looking itself. I know about the girl. I know she comes this way. I know you know what that means. Then he walked back into the trees and was gone. The clearing was very quiet in his wake. The spring made its small sound. Somewhere in the distance, a bird moved through branches. Seojin stood motionless for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to his house in the forest, and inside the small, still space of it, he sat and felt the bead pulse in his chest and understood, with the absolute clarity of a being who has never in 9 centuries been afraid of anything, that he was now afraid. Not for himself. He did not tell her. This was the first failure, not a failure of courage exactly but of judgment. He told himself he was protecting her. He told himself that to name the danger would be to make it real for her, and she had come to the forest to find something gentle, something unhurried, something that stood apart from the grinding weight of debt and illness and obligation that had brought her to the mountain in the first place. He told himself all of this with the careful architecture of a being who had spent 900 years justifying his own silences, and he believed it with the particular conviction of someone who has confused self-deception with wisdom. What was true, what he would not yet look at directly, was simpler. He did not want her to be afraid of the forest, because the forest was where she came to him. And if she stopped coming, the shape of her absence would be the last thing he felt before whatever was left of him faded entirely into something that no longer deserved the name of living. So he said nothing. He watched the path each morning with different eyes now, Not the patient eyes of someone waiting for something welcome, but the measuring eyes of someone calculating distance and time and the speed of threats. He extended his senses further into the trees. He moved the hours of his meditation to the edges of his land where the mountain opened into the broader wilderness, listening for the particular density of Kang Daehyun's presence. What he found over the days that followed was worse than a direct approach. The hunter was not hiding. He was settling. He had taken a room at the edge of the village. Seojin learned this from the pattern of the village sounds, which shifted and reconfigured around the presence of a stranger in the way a stream reconfigures around a new stone. He was asking questions. Careful ones, indirect ones, the kind that gathered information without appearing to seek it. He was speaking with the older villagers about the history of the mountain. He was asking about unusual things seen in the forest. He was, with the patience of a man who had done this many times before, constructing a net of knowledge around his quarry, and he was doing it inside the village, where his quarry could not follow without revealing himself entirely. He was using the village as a weapon. And then he began to use something more precise. Era met him on a morning in mid-spring on the path between her brother's house and the market, and she told Seojin about it that afternoon with the faint puzzlement of someone who isn't sure why an encounter left a residue. He had been pleasant, she said. Polite. He had asked if she knew the mountain paths well, and she had said yes, somewhat. She had been going up to gather herbs, and he had said he was a botanist of sorts, interested in the rare plants of the high slopes, and might he sometime accompany her? And she had said perhaps she would think about it, and he had smiled and walked on, and the whole conversation was entirely ordinary. Except for the way his eyes had gone to her hands as she spoke. The gesture was subtle. Most people wouldn't have registered it. Era registered it because she was the kind of person who noticed the way eyes moved when they were reading something that wasn't the face. His eyes had gone to her hands with a specific attention, and then back to hers, and in the fraction of a second between the two she had felt something she couldn't name. A sense of being assessed. Not as a person but as a position. He asked about you, she added, almost as an afterthought, the way people mention things that have been sitting with them longer than they've admitted. Whether I knew the man who lived in the forest. I said yes. He seemed interested in that. Seojin was quiet for a long time. Don't speak to him again, he said. She looked at him. He was facing the spring, and his profile was composed, that particular composure that she had learned, over months of knowing him, to read as the controlled surface over something much more active. She had learned the difference between his natural stillness and his deliberate stillness. This was the second kind. Seojin, she said. There are people who come to these mountains looking for things that aren't theirs to take, he said. He is one of them. What does he want? Another silence. Longer. Something I have, he said. And then, before she could ask the obvious next question, he turned and looked at her with that gaze. The ancient, amber-weighted gaze that had depth in it like a well has depth, something far down that you can sense without seeing. I will keep you safe. That is what I can tell you. That's not what I asked. I know, he said quietly. I know what you asked. He did not answer it. The first failure had been silence. The second failure was thinking that silence could hold. What happened in the weeks that followed had the quality of a season changing, inevitable in retrospect, impossible to pinpoint in the moment. Kang Daehyun moved through the village like weather, patient and pervasive, and the village, in the way of small communities that receive strong personalities, organized itself around him. He was generous with money, moderate in his demands, and he had the kind of authority that does not announce itself but is simply present, the way a mountain is present. You don't decide to notice it, you simply find yourself oriented toward it. He found Youngwon. This was perhaps inevitable. Youngwon had been afraid for a long time, and fear, when it has been kept private long enough, develops a gravitational pull toward whatever thing might make it make sense. Kang Daehyun had an explanation for Jungwon's fear. He had names for it and a framework, and the quiet authority of someone who had dealt with these things before and survived. He told Youngwon what Seojin was, not as a horror story but as a fact of the natural world, delivered with the steady matter-of-factness of a physician explaining a diagnosis. He told him about the fox bead. He told him about the power it contained, the rarity of it, the 900 years of accumulated spiritual energy that lived inside a single Gumiho who was almost ready to ascend. He did not tell Youngwon that he intended to take it for himself. He did not need to. He only told Youngwon that his sister was in danger, and that he had come to make sure she was safe, and that to make her safe, the Gumiho needed to be stopped. Youngwon, who had been sleeping with salt on his windowsills for years, believed every word. Seojin felt the shift before he understood it. He felt it the way he felt weather, A change in pressure, a reconfiguration of the forces around the village? He extended his senses down the mountain and found, with a cold precision of recognition, that the net had drawn tighter. That it now included people he had known, in the peripheral way of a careful hermit, for 5 years. That it included Youngwon. He felt it, and he went very still, and in the stillness he made a calculation that 900 years of accumulated wisdom should have guided differently. He decided to speak to Era. He would tell her. Not everything, not the full shape of what he was, not the bead, not the ascension, not the laws he had already violated by loving her. But enough. Enough to explain the danger and why she needed to trust him and stay away from the valley until the hunter had been dealt with. He went to the edge of the forest on a morning in late spring and waited for her. She did not come. He waited until the sun was directly above the pines and she did not come. He waited until the shadows had lengthened into afternoon, and she did not come. He went back to his house and understood in the silence of it, that the net had already closed. She came the next morning, but the way she came was different. Her footsteps on the path had a reluctance in them. She was a person who moved with lightness, with that quality of natural ease, and the weight in her step now was new. He knew before she entered the clearing. He knew in the same way he had known many things across centuries, not through any mystical perception, but through the simple and devastating accumulation of attention. He knew her the way she had once known him, by looking long enough and carefully enough to see past the surface. She stopped at the edge of the clearing and did not come further. "My brother told me what you are," she said. He did not respond immediately. He let the words sit in the air between them, giving them room, giving her room. "And what did he say I am?" he asked, though he already knew. "A Gumiho." Her voice was carefully neutral, not frightened, not angry, but held at a distance from both, which was its own kind of answer. "He said you've been here for years. Watching the village. That the things you feel aren't real, they're a manipulation. That it's what your kind does, to get close enough to take what they need." "And what do I need?" he asked. She finally met his eyes. Hers were wet, but her face was steady. She was not a person who came apart easily, and he loved her for that, and the love was, in this moment, a particular kind of pain. "He said your kind takes livers. The life force of humans. That everything, the herbs, the paths, the spring, all of it, was preparation." The clearing was very quiet. "Era," he said. "Tell me it isn't true." "It is and it isn't," he said, and he heard how insufficient that was even as he said it, but he had spent too long in honest silence to begin now with clean comfortable lies. "What I am, yes. I am a Gumiho. I have been for 900 years. What your brother said about my kind in general, there is history to it, it is an invention. But what I am to you, how would I know the difference?" Her voice broke just slightly on the last word, not from grief he thought, but from the effort of the question. She was asking it in earnest. She genuinely did not know, and the not knowing was the wound. "You wouldn't," he said. "There is nothing I can say that proves it. I know that." She stood in the clearing for a long time. The spring made its sound. The light came through the pines in that particular late spring way, the warm green quality of it that had, over months, become associated in both their minds with this exact place, this exact time of day, the particular quality of being somewhere that has become home without anyone deciding it should. "The man in the village," she said finally. "Kang Dae-hyun. He told my brother about you." "Yes. My brother trusts him." "I know." She looked at him. "Do you know why he came here? What he actually wants?" And here was the place where Seojin's second, larger silence finally broke. He told her, all of it or almost all. The fox bead. The 900 years. The ascension that was now 41 years away, the laws of his nature, the incompatibility of attachment and the path he had been walking. The hunter, what Kang Dae-hyun truly was, what he truly sought, the things a man willing to pursue a 900-year-old fox bead had done before and would do again. He told her with the exhausted relief of someone releasing a thing that has been held too long, and she listened with the quality of attention that had, in another life only months ago, been the most treasured thing he had ever been given. When he finished, the silence between them was different from any silence they had shared before. "You were never going to tell me," she said. "Not as an accusation. As a recognition." "No," he said. "I was going to find a way to protect you without telling you anything that would change what we—" He stopped. "I thought I could hold it. You thought you could keep me safe inside a lie." "I thought I could keep you safe," he said. The lie was the method. The intention was real. She closed her eyes. "That's what everyone says." She left the forest that day without resolving it. Without saying what she believed. without offering him the reassurance he had not asked for but had, without meaning to, arranged his entire posture around needing. He stood in the clearing after she was gone and felt the bead pulse in his chest, steady and faithful and full of everything he'd built, and he recognized with absolute clarity what was going to happen. Not because of prophecy or mystical foresight, but because he was 900 years old and he had watched humans and situations and the way consequence flows from cause, and the shape of what was coming was perfectly visible to anyone willing to look at it without flinching. Kang Daehyun was not after just the bead. He was after a specific kind of moment. The moment when the Gumiho was most vulnerable, most exposed, most separated from the careful discipline that had kept him protected across centuries. He had constructed this moment with patience and skill. The brother, the doubt, the rupture between Seojin and the one person whose presence had been keeping him anchored to something worth protecting. He had used Era not as a target but as a lever. And the lever had worked. That evening, a message came to the edge of the forest, not delivered by any person, but left on a stone at the tree line in a way that required specific knowledge of the mountain's geography to know where to leave it. Brief, handwritten, in the manner of a man who did not waste words because he had spent considerable time learning their exact value. She will be on the south path at dusk. Alone. I suggest you come. It was signed with nothing. It did not need to be. Seojin read it and was already moving. The south path at dusk was exactly as described. She was there, walking back toward the village in the fading light, her cloth bundle on her back, moving with the distracted inwardness of someone who has been thinking hard about something for a long time and has not yet arrived at the end of it. She did not hear him come through the trees. She did not hear the other man either. She heard the arrow. It came from the tree line on the western side of the path and it was aimed, not to kill, Seojin registered in the terrible clarity of the moment, but to wound. Placed with surgical precision below the ribs, enough to incapacitate, enough to bleed, enough to bring the Gumiho to exactly the posture of desperation that made him weakest. Kang Daehyun had not come to steal the fox bead. He had come to make Seojin offer it. She went down into the frost-hardened earth before he could reach her. Her fingers curled against the ground. Her breath came in shallow, wet increments. He was beside her in the space between heartbeats. This was the moment the story opened with, the full weight of it now visible in a way the opening could only gesture toward. The pale moonlight. Her wound. His hands pressed flat against his chest, against the pulse of 900 years. He did not hesitate. He had already known, standing in the clearing with her message hours ago, reading the shape of what was coming, that he was going to do this. He had known it the way you know things you've already decided without deciding them, in the body, in the stillness, in the part of the self that exists below the architecture of reasoning and simply is what it is. He had chosen her in early autumn without knowing it. Every subsequent day had been the execution of that choice. He pressed his palm to her lips and exhaled, and the bead left him in a warmth that moved through his entire body as it went, not painlessly, not like releasing a breath, but like releasing something structural, something load-bearing, some central pillar whose removal caused the whole interior to shift and groan. The amber light rose and dispersed. Her gasp tore through the quiet of the clearing. Her fingers uncurled. And from the tree line, 30 feet away, Kang Daehyun stepped into the moonlight. He had watched it happen. He had waited for exactly this, had engineered exactly this, and now he moved toward them with the measured pace of a man who has already won and knows it. His eyes were fixed on the dispersing light, on the residue of it in the air above Era's body, and there was in his face an expression that was not quite hunger, not quite triumph, but something between the two, the expression of someone for whom this moment has been the organizing principle of a very long life. 900 years, he said looking at Seojin. I've been looking for a bead that old for 30 years. He paused. I didn't expect it to give itself up. Seojin rose from his knees. He was already diminished. He could feel it, the beginning of the unraveling, the slow withdrawal of 9 centuries of power from a body that had been built to contain it. His senses were narrowing. The extraordinary extension of perception that had let him read the forest, read the village, read the pressure of a person's presence a mile away, it was contracting, pulling back, becoming merely human in its reach. His body felt suddenly, appallingly heavy, as though gravity had just discovered it. But he was not yet gone. And Kang Daehyun was close. What happened in the next few minutes was not, in the end, the kind of confrontation where skill and power determined the outcome. It was determined by something older than skill. Seojin moved between the hunter and the woman on the ground, and he stayed there, and what Kang Daehyun found, what he had not, perhaps, fully calculated, was that a Gumiho without his bead was not simply a diminished Gumiho. He was something different. Something that had already lost the thing it was protecting, and therefore had nothing left to lose. There is a particular kind of danger that belongs to things with nothing left to lose. Seojin used what remained of his power the way a man uses the last of his water in a desert. With total commitment, with zero reservation, with the absolute clarity of knowing there will be no opportunity to conserve what remains. He drove Kang Daehyun back into the trees. He drove him back against the mountain. He used the forest itself, the silence of it, the knowledge of it, the 9 centuries of intimacy with every slope and hollow and root system of this particular piece of the world, and he pressed the hunter until the hunter was no longer advancing. It was not a victory. It was a delay. And Seojin knew the difference. He came back to Era in the clearing and found her sitting upright, one hand pressed to her side where the wound had closed, not healed entirely, still raw but closed, the bead's first gift already given. Her eyes found him in the dark. Seojin. I need you to go down to the village, he said. His voice was already different, not wrong exactly but thinner, the particular resonance gone from it, the quality that had always made it feel like something said in a large and ancient room. Go now while he's back in the trees. Don't come back up the mountain tonight. What are you going to do? He looked at her for a moment. The moon was full, and in the moonlight she was exactly herself, the precise, irreducible specific weight of her, every version of her he had watched through every season layered in the looking, autumn era and winter era and spring era and this era. Here now, looking up at him from the frost-cold ground with her wound closed and her eyes open and her whole face asking the question she hadn't spoken yet. What I should have done when he first came, he said. That isn't an answer. It's the only one I have. He helped her to her feet. He made sure she was standing, that her legs held. He did not allow himself any more than that because he was 900 years old and he understood the economy of last moments, that to linger in them is to misuse them, that what they require is not duration but presence, and he was present, completely, in the second that he held her upright with both hands and felt her breathe. Then he stepped back. Go, he said. She went. She looked back once at the edge of the tree line, and the expression on her face was the one he would carry, for as long as he could carry anything, as the last thing. He turned back to the forest and the hunter and the remaining work of the night. The full moon rose to its apex as Seojin moved deeper into the forest, toward the ridge where he had driven Kang Daehyun and where the hunter was, he knew, preparing to come back with the full force of whatever he had held in reserve. The forest was silent around him in the old way, the way it had always been silent in his presence, the deference of lesser things to something greater, and he noted, with a clarity that had in it nothing of grief and everything of simple recognition, that this silence would not follow him much longer. He was fading. He could feel it as he walked, the incremental withdrawal like warmth leaving a room when a fire goes out. His memory was the first to go at the edges. Small things, peripheral things, the names of certain plants, the exact words of conversations decades old, the faces of people who had passed through his long life and left impressions that were, one by one, releasing their grip. It did not hurt exactly. It was more like the sensation of a room gradually darkening, each lost thing a candle extinguishing, the total space of him growing smaller. He found Kang Daehyun on the ridge. The hunter had prepared carefully. He had gathered the ambient energy of the bead's dispersal, that residue in the air that an ordinary person couldn't feel but that a man who had spent 30 years hunting these things could read like a scent, and he had used it to reinforce himself, to shore up the advantages he'd always had over a Gumiho already diminished. He was formidable. He had always been formidable, that was not the question. The question was what Seojin had that Kang Daehyun did not. The answer was the mountain. 900 years. Every stone, every hollow, every old root and hidden spring and place where the ridge opened onto a drop and the drop opened onto darkness. He had moved through this mountain in every season, in every body, human and fox and something between, and he knew it the way you know the inside of your own chest. And Kang Daehyun, for all his preparation, had been here for weeks. The confrontation on the ridge was not swift. It was long and ugly and cost Seojin things he could feel leaving him in real time, fragments of memory, fragments of power, each exchange taking more than it gave. But he kept his feet. He kept his direction. He maneuvered Kang Daehyun toward the place he had chosen, the place where the ridge narrowed above a long drop, and he kept the hunter's attention entirely on himself, entirely on the diminishing power still crackling at his fingertips, never allowing the hunter's eyes to go back down toward the village, back toward the path where a wounded woman was making her way to safety. In the end it was not a spectacular thing. Seojin simply stopped retreating. He turned and stood in the narrow place and let Kang Daehyun's full force come at him, and he used the last of what the bead had left in him, the residue, the echo, the 900 years of memory still warm in his bones, to hold his ground for long enough. For long enough that the hunter's momentum carried him past the edge of the ridge in the confusion of the collision. For long enough that the mountain, which had held Seojin for 9 centuries, finally did what the mountain does to things that come to it with violence. The sound of it was brief. Then the mountain was silent. Seojin stood at the edge of the ridge and looked down into the darkness below for a long moment. He could feel the cold coming into his hands now, not weather cold but the cold of absence, the temperature of a body that has been vacated by something essential. His thoughts were simplifying. The elaborate internal architecture of 9 centuries, the layered memories, the accumulated knowledge, the precise and intricate self that had been constructed year by year across a millennium, was contracting to something smaller, quieter, more like a single note than a symphony. He turned away from the ridge and began to walk back down the mountain. He did not make it to the village. He made it to the clearing by the spring, and that was where his legs stopped working in the way legs are supposed to work, and he sat down on the flat stone where he had sat on 100 mornings and listened to the water and felt the particular rightness of a place that has become yours. The spring sounded exactly as it always had. The pine trees were the same trees. The moss on the stone was the same moss. The world held its form with the indifference of things that do not require you to be present in order to continue. He sat. The moon was still full and high, and in its light the clearing was silver white and still, and after a while he heard footsteps on the path. Her footsteps, which he still knew, which he would know for as long as he knew anything, because they were the last thing his memory had kept when everything else had begun to simplify. She had not gone to the village. She had gone to the cedar line and waited because she was, fundamentally, a person who paid attention, and she had paid enough attention to Seojin over enough months to know that what he had said, "Go to the village, don't come back," was a thing said to protect her and not, in any meaningful sense, a thing he believed she would do. She came into the clearing and found him on the stone and sat beside him without speaking, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, which was consistent with who they had always been together. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "He won't come back." "I know." The wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. The spring spoke its small perpetual language. Around them, the forest was beginning to do the thing it did when something ancient was completing itself. Not mourning exactly, but something in the register of mourning, a settling, a profound and wordless acknowledgement. "I can't feel the far edges anymore," he said. "The mountain. The village. It used to extend, I could hear the whole of it all at once." He paused. "Now it stops at the trees." "What does it feel like?" she asked. He considered it honestly, in the way he had always considered her questions, with the full weight of his attention. "Small," he said. "It feels small. But not badly small." Another pause. "The way a room feels small when it has the right people in it." She took his hand. He looked down at their hands together, hers warm and living, his cooling, growing lighter, the specific gravity of him decreasing with each breath as the fox nature completed its withdrawal. She held on. He felt the holding. "Don't," he started. "I know," she said. "I need you to." "I know." Her voice was very steady. "I know what you're going to say. That I should go. That this is easier alone. That it's better." She did not look at him. She looked at the spring. "You've been protecting me from difficult things since the autumn. You can stop now." He was quiet. "I want to be here," she said. "I choose to be here. You don't get to take that from me too." He looked at her for a long time. His vision was simplifying, the colors softening, the edges blurring, the extraordinary acuity of a Gumiho's sight becoming the ordinary sight of a diminished thing. She was still entirely visible. She was, in fact, the last thing in full clarity, everything else hazed and distant and increasingly abstract, but her face, turned toward the spring, turned toward the sound of running water, precisely, completely present. He had 900 years of things he could have said. He chose the only one that mattered. "I chose you," he said quietly, "over what I am. I want you to know, it was not a sacrifice. It was a preference. The only one in 900 years that felt entirely like mine." She closed her eyes. The wind picked up from the north, carrying the particular cold of the high ridge, and with it something else, a warmth that moved through the cold like a current through dark water, amber and ancient, the last dispersal of 9 centuries returning to the air that had always contained it. It moved through the clearing with a gentleness that did not belong to wind. It lifted, it softened, it passed through and around the 2 figures on the flat stone by the spring with the quality of something that has found, at the very end, exactly where it wanted to be. Era felt it on her face, on her hands, moving through her hair with a warmth that lingered even after it had passed. When she opened her eyes, the stone beside her was empty. Not cold. Not abandoned. Simply empty, in the way a room is empty after something wonderful has been in it, still warm, still carrying the shape of what was there, so recently and so completely present that the absence was almost indistinguishable from presence. Almost. She sat for a long time beside the spring, alone in the clearing under the full moon, listening to the water, which had nothing to say about loss and nothing to say about love, and continued, faithful and indifferent and perpetual, to make the same small sound it had always made. The pine trees held their form. The moss on the stone remained. The world was exactly what it was, unchanged in any observable way, as though nothing of consequence had happened in it. She stayed until the moon began to move. Then she rose and gathered what remained of herself, and took the east path back down toward the village, the same path he had shown her on the first afternoon, the path she had taken 100 times since, whose every stone and root she knew by now with her body rather than her mind. The path that had always until now run in both directions. In the years that followed she returned to the clearing. She did not go often, and she did not go with any particular purpose, not to grieve, not to search, not to perform any ritual of remembrance. She went the way you return to a place that has become part of the geography of who you are, the way the body knows certain coordinates without the mind needing to decide them. In summer, when the light came through the pines in that warm green way. In winter, when the frost came to the stone and the spring steamed in the cold air. She brought her herb bundles. She sat by the water. Sometimes, on particular evenings, when the wind moved from the north with that specific warmth threaded through the cold, she would hold very still and let it touch her face and not name what she felt, because some things are diminished by naming. The village built a small marker at the cedar line, not at her request and not with any explanation, only because old communities sometimes know, without being told, where the weight of a thing came to rest and needs acknowledging. She passed it each time without stopping. She was not unhappy. That was the part that surprised her, in the end, the part that no story about loss ever quite prepares you for. She had expected to be hollowed by it. She had expected the rest of her life to feel like a room with a piece of furniture missing, the shape of the absence more present than anything that filled it. Instead she found that he had left things inside her, not as a Gumiho leaves things, not with the old hunger's mechanism of taking and replacing. He had left things the way time leaves things, gradually, as accumulation, as the slow deposit of one season after another. The names of plants, the reading of mountain weather, the way certain animals move when they are at ease, the practice of attention, the willingness to sit beside running water and let the silence be sufficient. She carried these without effort. They were simply part of her now. And on the mornings when the wind came down from the ridge with its particular warmth, when the amber quality of the light through the pines made the clearing look the way it had looked on 100 mornings when she had not been alone in it, on those mornings she would feel something she had no precise word for. Not grief. Not joy. Something that contained both without resolving into either. The feeling of a love that had not ended so much as changed its form. Dispersed into the air. Into the mountain. Into the warmth she carried in the place just behind her sternum, that dense and inexplicable pulse that had no anatomical explanation and had been there, without interruption, since the night the amber light had moved through her and her wound had closed and she had gasped back into a world she had briefly been leaving. She suspected in her clearest moments what it was. She never confirmed it. She did not need to. She simply carried it, warm and steady and faithful as a spring, and she went about her life on the mountain, and the mountain went about its mountain life around her, and the pines were green in all their seasons, and the spring never once ran dry. The nine-tailed fox is gone. But his warmth still lingers here. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales like this. Stories of love, sacrifice, and the unknown. Thank you.